king falls in love with a poor maiden, and he is trying to figure out, what do I do? How do I establish a relationship with her? And he realizes, and he's discussing it with his subjects, and he realizes, if I were to just walk right up to her and say, I'm the king, I want to date you, or something like this, there's some negatives to that. Number one, I wouldn't necessarily know, is she just doing this because I'm the king and she just wants to get into a more lavish lifestyle as the queen? And number two, it might intimidate her and it might drive her away. It's not the ideal circumstance in which to fall in love with someone, because there's so many other dynamics involved. And so he's trying to figure out all these different scenarios, and just cutting to the chase, he realizes the best way to do it is to become a poor beggar himself. And he lives next to her as a poor beggar and enters into that lifestyle. And in the context of that, pursues her and they fall in love. And the idea of the metaphor in part is to help us to envision God's intention in the kind of revelation he has given us, especially with the incarnation of Jesus.
I think one of the analogies that you used or referenced was, what if when God incarnated himself, he was, what would you say, 6 meters tall instead of 6 feet tall? So, or, I've heard William Lane Craig say, why doesn't it say in the genetic code, instead of random, or not random, but instead of letters in a certain combination, why doesn't it say Jesus Christ is Lord, Jesus Christ is Lord on repeat? And there's a bunch of ways of getting at this idea, but can you unpack, I guess, that as an expectation, which is what you previously discussed, and then you made an interesting point that that's not necessarily a more effective, that wouldn't be a necessarily more effective way at getting at what God is getting at with humans. And I think that was so interesting. And I want you to kind of unpack that for my audience.
Yeah. The 6 meter tall incarnate person idea is from Kierkegaard. That's one of his ideas. And if nothing else that I say in this is heard by people, I hope they'll hear this one thing, and that is to check out Kierkegaard and Blaise Pascal, who are the two Christian thinkers in the Christian tradition that I think speak most powerfully to this question, and they can certainly help people far more than I could. I'm just trying to channel Kierkegaard and Pascal in many of my comments in my video. In the context of that 6 meter tall incarnation, or 6 yards comment, what Kierkegaard is saying is that wouldn't be for our good. If God came, because the whole point of the incarnation is that God comes in incognito. Pascal has a passage where he says, don't deride us for worshiping a hidden God. This is precisely what the prophets anticipate and proclaim. We worship a hidden God. This is the glory of our religion, that God sneaks into a tiny manger. He's an ordinary carpenter. When God becomes a man, he doesn't come with fanfare and applause. He dies on a cross. This is a very different kind of revelation, but Kierkegaard and Pascal are saying, this is actually the kind of revelation that we need, because our deepest, just to state maybe the main thing right up front, and knowing this will be maybe offensive to some, but what they say is the Christian message is our main need isn't perfect intellectual clarity. Our main need is the changing of our will. In Christianity, there's this word sin, which means a deep brokenness, a fundamental brokenness in all of us, internally and in our relationships, in our orientation. And so that's our main problem, and that a direct revelation wouldn't necessarily resolve that problem. So, they're talking about how in the Bible, when there's miracles, people respond really badly a lot of times. Many times it'll be like Pharaoh hardening his heart. The more plagues come, the more he hardens his heart. And the 85% figure at least raises this question of, would it actually be good for us if God had a 6 meter tall incarnation, or wrote his Jesus is Lord in the genetic code, or wrote in the sky every night at 5 p.m. through the clouds, I am God? Would that actually be good for us? If there's a fundamental resistance in the human heart to God, then just bombardment of miracles is not actually necessarily for our good. And maybe, that's a really... That's a point that is nuanced enough that, we can keep canvassing this as you want and kind of circle that and kind of explore that a little bit. But the other thing I'll just briefly say is, it's also good to ask our friends, what are you expecting in terms of God's revelation in light of who God is, it's also not clear that a bombardment of miracles is necessarily the clearest revelation of God. Because, like one of the points that comes up in the philosophical literature about this is that conscience, in some respects, is a more reliable form of communication from God than a burning bush. And I think there's some reasons to at least give that point some consideration. So conscience being the revelation of God's moral nature in this kind of deeply intuitive way that's like stamped on our heart. We just have a sense that good and evil matter and that they're robust categories, fixed categories that have significance at a transcendent level. We all feel that. So if I was getting a burning bush like Moses in Exodus 3, I would be getting information that in some respects is more questionable than the information I'm getting from conscience. The burning bush could be an alien, it could be a hallucination, or it could be a demon. But conscience is telling me something that is an eternal truth, that love is good. And so I understand that that could be frustrating for someone who's really in the travail of struggle about this, but I'm just at least wanting to put it out on the table for us to start, working through.
There's a desire for love through the will that God has, not just raw belief. And I think that story points towards that. So I don't know, maybe share that story and anything else that you want to wrap around it.
Sure. I love this story. And I may even get emotional talking about it because it's such a beautiful, poignant way. I mean, this is one thing about the Christian imagination is it certainly kind of has a beauty and a charm to it, So I'll explain the metaphor and then I'll maybe make the point from the metaphor that I take from it. And I think Kierkegaard is kind of gesturing towards. This is from Kierkegaard's Philosophical Fragments, a text he wrote. And the idea is a king falls in love with a poor maiden. And he is trying to figure out, what do I do? How do I establish a relationship with her? And he realizes, and he's discussing it with his subjects, and he realizes if I were to just walk right up to her and say, I'm the king, I want to date you or something like this, there's some negatives to that. Number one, I wouldn't necessarily know, is she just doing this because I'm the king and she just wants to get into a more lavish lifestyle as the queen? And number two, it might intimidate her and it might drive her away. It's not the ideal circumstance in which to fall in love with someone, because there's so many other dynamics involved. And so he's trying to figure out all these different scenarios, and just cutting to the chase, he realizes the best way to do it is to become a poor beggar himself. And he lives next to her as a poor beggar and enters into that lifestyle. And in the context of that, pursues her and they fall in love. And the idea of the metaphor in part is to help us to envision God's intention in the kind of revelation he has given us, especially with the incarnation of Jesus. So the Christian idea is that God became a man, God became a person, a creature, and that's Jesus Christ. And then Jesus effected a way for us to have salvation and reunion with God. And I guess what gives that such plausibility to me is related to what we got into a little bit ago from the 85% figure, and just what I know in my own life, what is in my own heart, and as I look around, especially at human history, but also at the world right now. I think it's a plausible idea that there is a lot of resistance to God. I think the basic idea of sin makes a lot of sense. The old Christian idea that we're all broken, we're all cut out, we're all kind of twisted because we've fallen away from our Creator. And so if there is a resistance to God, then it makes sense to me that the kind of revelation that would be most effective at establishing relationship and love would be one that doesn't just sort of provide perfect clarity for the mind, though it needs sufficient clarity, and we can talk about that, but also is designed to address what is our deepest problem, and that is our will and our resistance. And another way to put it is perhaps the God we need is not a 6 meter tall incarnate God, but an incarnate God who's dying on a cross, saying, "Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do."
I have created something for you, and I think it's special. Check this out. It's called the Wisdom Society, and what it is a growing community of believers from around the world. We meet weekly, discuss tough questions, read scripture, pray. There's also a book club where we are joined by the author of the book so that we can discuss the book directly with the author. We have Paul Copan, Stephen Meyer, J. Warner Wallace, Hugh Ross, and other experts that you've seen on this channel in that book club. I'm trying to connect the experts with you guys in a more intimate capacity. This just launched. It's currently less than $1 a day for access to everything. I've put a ton of time and resources into building this. So join today, support the channel, invest in yourself, grow in faith, connect with believers from around the world and the experts that you see on this channel. I hope this is a huge blessing to you guys. I hope it's a no-brainer to join based on the way that it's structured, and I hope to meet you there inside of the Wisdom Society.